Hi there, Wizard Apprentices. So this is going to be a quick video that I will update later, make it a little bit more formal, but I wanted to show you something that I got asked in the community. And that is, how do I build a flow where I want a user to select more than one record and then do something with those records? And that can be tricky. So here's an example of something that we want to do. I have a bunch of assets on an account, and then I want to go through and have the user open a flow, tell me which assets they want to modify, and then update those assets. And let me show you first what it looks like now that it's done, and then we'll dive in and take a look at the flow. So I'm doing this through a flow action. This is something that's available for Lightning. And when I click on this, I'm presented with a list of assets, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick 3 of them and click next. And it says my asset 4 was not selected to be updated. Click next. And it says asset 2, do I want to put in a price? I'll go ahead and put in, 100. And it says the same for asset 5. And now it tells me asset 3 was not selected. And here we go with asset 1. And there we go, and we can see my price has been updated here. So that is a lot of screens, but it gets you the idea that what I've done is I've asked the user to say, tell me which assets you want to select, and then when at the time I presented with the choice to say how do you want to modify that in particular asset. So let's take a look at the flow. It's a little weird to do this. The first thing we need is a screen to ask what assets do you want to use. And for me, I find the best way to do this is with a dynamic choice. So I have a dynamic choice field here using a dynamic choice for assets. And when we take a look at what that dynamic choice looks like, we will see that all I'm doing is saying go grab assets on an account, display the name of the asset as the label, so that's what the user will see on the screen, and then store the ID. This is where it gets a little on the weird side, because the way that gets stored is when multiple records get selected, is it's stored in a semi-comma delimited format. So ID, semicolon, ID, semicolon, and so forth. So we have to do something for that. Before we do it, we're going to go ahead and get all the assets. And this is a fast lookup, saving our assets into a subject collection. And we're doing it with the same criteria. So ideally, if I look at my collection and I look at my dynamic choice, it's going to return the exact same values. We'll then loop through it, and we need to have a decision to say, is the individual asset that I'm looking at in the collection, does it exist in the selection that the user provided? And this is the weird part. So I have a variable here that I'm simply saying, does this variable contain the current asset ID? And if it does, it means it's selected. So why do I have a variable? Why don't I just reference the screen here? And this is just one of those oddball things with Flow that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But if you went and you referenced the screen for what assets have been selected, and then you used it in a decision, you'll actually get the name or the label of the choice and not the stored value. So what I like to do is I just create a variable that stores text where the default value is the screen input field. So this is the field that's on that very first screen that allows people to select assets. And this turns it into the ID. So ID, semicolon, ID, and so forth. That allows me to do the decision. Once the decision's in place, I now know that each individual asset, which of them has been selected and which has not. So to make it a little bit more obvious, I have 2 directions. So if it wasn't selected, I display a screen that says not selected. You don't have to do that. You can simply have this arrow return back to the loop, but it doesn't look very nice for videos. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and select the asset, and I'm going to say, okay, what do you want to do with that? And you could have whatever you want on here, whatever type of information you want to collect, whether it's pulling information from the asset or you're intending it to update the asset or do something else with it. But you have that ID, and you have that as an S object, so you have a lot of flexibility. In my scenario, I'm updating. So I ask for a price, and then I go on my next assignment, and I say, okay, now that I have the price from the user, I'm going to go ahead and set that price in the asset. And then because we're not updating every asset in the collection, we're only updating certain assets, I'm going to go ahead and create a new collection called Updated Assets. And then I'm going to add this one asset that I've updated into my collection. And then we just repeat the loop until we get to the end. And at the very end is where we update with a fast collection. And that's what gets us our capability to ask for multiple assets in one screen and then do something with them. Now, do you have to use screens? No, absolutely not. You can simply have the screen here to say, well, what asset do you want to select? And then everything else below that, it doesn't require user input. It all depends on what you're trying to do. But this gives you a really quick overview of how you can do this. And like I said, we'll put together a more formal video with all the fancy stuff and screens later, which will probably replace this one. So until then, thanks for watching. And remember, the magic is out there. It's yours for the taking.